What sort of reality compels its own deities to conceal an entire planet within a star's shadow? Tonight, we venture into Nibiru, the world the Anunnaki attempted to wipe from existence. We will explore why their homeland entered its final days, the methods they used to hide it, and the significance of the recently identified return signal. Stay with me closely. Their world defied every norm. If these concealed narratives captivate you, please subscribe and remain here with me. Now, we begin with the precise moment Nibiru first entered its decline. Nibiru was never missing. It remained concealed far beyond the sun, within a region our observation instruments can scarcely reach. Exists something astronomers mention only with extreme caution: the solar magnetic dead zone, a location where light curves incorrectly, where transmissions dissolve into nothingness, and where gravitational forces act as though something pulls from beyond a veil of flames. Within this zone, celestial bodies do not disappear into blackness. They disappear into radiance, overwhelmed by the sun's own emissions. And within that impossible luminosity, an entire world can remain undetected. When Nibiru entered its collapse phase, the Anunnaki understood their planet could no longer drift openly across the cosmos. Too many observers existed, too many sentinels, too many civilizations who could perceive it as danger. So they accomplished something remarkable, something nearly beyond comprehension. They steered their failing world into the blind region of a star, into a refuge constructed not from darkness, but from overpowering brilliance. Nibiru did not vanish. It merely moved behind the sun and remained there. Most worlds trace clean and foreseeable trajectories, but Nibiru does not. Its path, even prior to Anunnaki interference, was unstable, irregular, and turbulent. Certain ancient records characterize it as a roaming star. However, the reality proves far more intricate. When Nibiru traversed the outer boundaries of the solar system, gravitational forces struck it like ocean swells. Across millennia, minor fractures developed within its outer shell, and its very orbit began fragmenting, not into distinct planets, but into segments, drifting masses that traced the original trajectory like spectral remnants. This phenomenon created what investigators presently term the fractal orbit theory. The concept that Nibiru might not travel as one unified world, but as multiple gravitational fragments, each affecting the others, each creating a pathway of distortions in their wake. If this proves accurate, then certain unusual objects we have observed entering the solar system, Oumuamua, Borisov, Atlas, and additional ones, might not be random visitors whatsoever. They could be remnants of a fractured world, pieces of Nibiru's ancient trajectory returning individually, like memories attempting to rediscover their origin. However, concealing a world involves more than simply drifting beyond the sun. Nibiru did not depend on fortune. It depended on intentional design. The Anunnaki engineered something termed the cloaking field, a planet-scale envelope of electromagnetic manipulation. Not a barrier and not true invisibility, but something more unusual. It warps the planet's heat signature, dampens its magnetic emissions, and wraps light around its exterior like a shroud. To our observation devices, Nibiru transforms into mere background interference. To our detection equipment, it becomes a thermal anomaly lost within solar disturbance. Certain fragmented Anunnaki records characterize this field as the skin of silence, a responsive armor woven from the planet's own core forces. It can only engage when Nibiru aligns with the sun's radiation current, meaning the planet possesses windows of complete invisibility, millennia of concealment, millennia of drifting unseen. And if the cloaking field remains operational, then the planet itself persists, still functioning, still waiting, still hidden within a passage of impossible light. The region where Nibiru conceals itself is not vacant space. It forms a tunnel carved not by physical matter, but by magnetic forces. Astronomers occasionally reference it as the heliomagnetic corridor, a restricted lane where solar particles flow in a consistent stream. Within it, a massive object can drift for ages, nearly suspended by the sun's own radiation. To an external viewer, the corridor appears turbulent, but inside it, movement becomes remarkably stable. Nibiru learned to navigate this current like a vessel on a cosmic waterway, and provided it stayed within this quiet stream, its existence merged flawlessly into the sun's natural din. Certain theorists even propose the Anunnaki modified this corridor, adjusting it marginally, strengthening it with emissions from Nibiru's core. If accurate, then the planet is not merely hiding, it is securing itself in a location where no gravitational calculation can readily trace it. All primitive civilizations that mentioned the invisible star, the concealed twin, or the roaming sun beyond the sun may have been describing this exact passage. A cosmic pathway where a world can drift unnoticed for thousands of years continuously. And Nibiru has been drifting there with patience, in silence, awaiting its orbit to reopen. Every concealed thing eventually shifts. And when Nibiru moves even marginally within the corridor, the solar field surrounding it trembles. These tremors generate something delicate, a configuration, a rhythm. For millennia, the rhythm remained steady, a subtle vibration lost within solar interference. But lately, something shifted. A minor irregularity in the sun's magnetic harmonics, an unusual dip identified in deep space surveillance systems, a murmur of movement where none should exist. To most researchers, it was rejected as background disturbance. But those who examine long-interval intruders identified it immediately. They term it simply the return pulse, a momentary variation in the solar magnetic shadow that only manifests when a substantial body starts shifting from alignment. Not approaching us, not presently, but repositioning, recalibrating, preparing to depart the dead zone after millennia in concealment. Ancient tablets reference this moment as the breath of the hidden star, the indication that its prolonged silence was concluding. And if this pulse holds truth, then the cycle has commenced already. Nibiru is shifting once more, drifting from its sanctuary of light and returning toward the exposed sky. A planet does not perish in one singular instant. It perishes in murmurs, in fractures, in subtle movements deep below its exterior. Nibiru's collapse started long before the Anunnaki comprehended what they confronted. Deep within the planet's core, flows of molten force began twisting from alignment. The internal rhythm that previously maintained their world's stability abruptly changed tempo. Days shortened. Seasons turned erratic, and peculiar crimson auroras manifested across their skies, shimmering like damaged cloth. Something was deteriorating from the interior outward. Initially, they assumed it was periodic, another brief phase within their extended orbit. But quickly, earthquakes spread throughout their continents, not as separate incidents, but as planetary tremors advancing in coordinated patterns. Oceans heated at the peripheries. Mountain formations split apart like aged ceramics. The sky dimmed without notice, then intensified again with searing brightness. These were not ordinary catastrophes. They were indicators of a core in rebellion, a world struggling against its own nature. And within that turbulence, the Anunnaki grasped the reality. Their homeland, their origin, was approaching its concluding period. Long before the population panicked, the researchers understood, deep below their settlements existed massive surveillance chambers, constructions older than any Anunnaki realm. These chambers documented the cadence of the planet's magnetic rhythm, the pulse of Nibiru itself. One day, that pulse wavered. The measurements declined, then increased, then declined once more, as if the core was choking. The irregularity was so unanticipated that investigators assumed their equipment was malfunctioning. But when they traveled into the deeper chambers, they experienced the vibrations with their own physical forms. The planet was communicating, and the transmission was unmistakable. Something was profoundly wrong. The most senior scholars named it the inward collapse. Not an outside danger, not an asteroid, not a cosmic impact. This was a gradual implosion of the planet's internal framework. Something had transformed in the energy circulation around the core. A transition so substantial it destabilized every magnetic line, every crustal plate, every atmospheric flow. The researchers alerted the governing assemblies, but even they could not comprehend the magnitude of what was developing. A world was perishing, and a civilization possessed only moments in cosmic time to determine its destiny. As Nibiru trembled, two perspectives emerged above all alternatives. Enki, the scientist king, who held faith in adaptation, in gaining wisdom from catastrophe, in preserving what remained salvageable, and Enlil, the commander, who held faith in authority, in order, and in relinquishing anything that could not be repaired. Their disagreement fractured the world. One group maintained the planet could still be stabilized, its orbit rectified, its core calmed. The alternative maintained that remaining on Nibiru meant certain death. These were not administrative discussions. They were existential separations determining the destiny of an entire race. The friction between them intensified with every tremor. Enki's supporters constructed stabilizing towers throughout the continents, attempting to soothe the magnetic disturbances. Enlil's contingents built evacuation structures, immense launch rings capable of propelling fleets toward the stars. When the planet shook, both factions accused each other. When the skies dimmed, each perceived the other as responsible. But underlying all their disagreement, a reality persisted like ash suspended in the atmosphere. The world they fought over was disappearing, and even their most profound wisdom could not rescue a perishing planet. The initial fractures manifested in locations nobody anticipated. Peaceful valleys, primordial plains, territories undisturbed for ages. At sunrise, wanderers described witnessing thin, luminous lines extending across the terrain, like faint cracks of radiance beneath the surface. But by dusk, those lines expanded and expanded until complete landscapes throbbed with liquid fire. Mountain ridges collapsed like fabric. Oceans rose upward, as if gravitational pull itself were quaking. The sky alternated between scarlet and white, as if the atmosphere was attempting to determine which hue suited a dying world. And then arrived the resonance, a deep, rolling vibration that traveled through every construction, every tower, every living creature. Not a quake, not thunder, something more ancient, something fundamental. The Anunnaki named it the voice beneath the world, a resonance that signified the core was transforming in ways no calculation could anticipate. Stabilizing mechanisms were activated. Energy towers illuminated the darkness, but nothing transformed. The planet was splitting itself apart gradually, intentionally, as if some unseen force was dismantling it from within. And the Anunnaki understood there was no restoration, only flight or annihilation. Every civilization experiences a moment, a solitary instant where refusal concludes, and reality ultimately settles like particles in the atmosphere. For the Anunnaki, that instant arrived when the great observatory, the most ancient construction on their planet, shifted position. It had remained for hundreds of millennia, unmoved by tempests, quakes, or cosmic forces. But on one quiet night, its base moved just several degrees, sufficient for its crystal beam calibration to fracture. And when the crystal faded, their world faded alongside it. The representation of their cosmic dominance had transformed into a caution. From the uppermost towers, they observed the horizon ripple, observed complete regions flicker like unstable projections. They understood then, beyond discussion, beyond governance, beyond optimism, that Nibiru was approaching a terminal collapse. The planet was no longer a dwelling. It was transforming into a recollection. And the sole question remaining was straightforward and horrifying. How do you preserve a civilization when you cannot preserve the world supporting it? That question would guide them into the subsequent chapter of their chronicle and the most remarkable exodus the universe has witnessed. Before Nibiru started to deteriorate, it was magnificent. Their capital did not rest on the surface like our settlements do. It floated, held aloft on enormous gravitational supports. The city elevated above the burning landscape like an island of rock and radiance. Its base consisted of rings of hovering platforms layered one upon another, each radiating gently with the resonance of primordial energy. At nightfall, the city glimmered with golden halos reflecting from clouds of floating crystal particles. To the Anunnaki, this was not sorcery, but construction so sophisticated it resembled a prayer inscribed into the heavens. From overhead, the capital appeared like an enormous mandala, a sacred configuration intended to direct the planet's inherent magnetic currents. Temples of obsidian quartz extended skyward like digits, each crowned with luminescent symbols that throbbed in synchronization with Nibiru's core. Beneath them, pathways of clear stone arced between towers, curving gently with gravitational pull itself. Even the atmosphere felt animated, resonating with gentle frequencies, delicate harmonics, the invisible pulse of a civilization that considered architecture not merely protection, but expression. Within these elevated streets, the Anunnaki existed, invented, and envisioned, and shortly they would be compelled to relinquish it all. The Anunnaki were not a uniform people, but an extensive, organized society. At the uppermost tier stood the Lightborn, the governing caste whose bodies had been modified across millennia of generations. Their eyes possessed golden irises that radiated gently in darkness. Their skin displayed faint illuminated markings. They were researchers, explorers, and protectors of cosmic principles. Below them existed the Stonebound, the constructors and designers who formed cities from crystal, metal, and electromagnetic rock. Their hands were more powerful, their perception more acute, their existence slightly extended. Each caste was formed, not by chance, but by purpose. Then there were the echo forms, the silent ones, beings developed to sustain the planet's internal mechanisms. The passages, the chambers, the ancient machinery humming below the surface. They seldom manifested in public, traveling like phantoms through the lower tiers of the floating structures. Nobody knew precisely how many existed or how ancient they genuinely were, but all castes grasped one reality. Their society operated because each division possessed a portion of the world's continuation. And when the planet started to deteriorate, those portions began to splinter. Even the Lightborn, the most brilliant minds of a perishing world, could not mend what had already commenced. To traverse through the capital was to traverse through a living dialect. Every tower, every bridge, every entrance possessed symbols that transformed gradually in the radiance. These were not ornamentations, they were manifestations of significance. The Anunnaki conveyed through luminescent glyphs, markings that reorganized themselves according to intention. Certain symbols intensified when approached, others diminished in quietness, awaiting interpretation. Their language flowed like liquid, altering form to correspond with emotion, recollection, or function. For them, inscription was not fixed, it was animate. Researchers proposed that their architecture functioned as a planetary network, a framework where significance traveled not through sound, but through vibration. When someone contacted a symbol etched into a crystal beam, the glyph vibrated gently, transmitting rhythms across adjacent constructions. Complete avenues could illuminate in reaction, conveying communications from tower to tower without a solitary uttered word. This was expression woven into rock, understanding embedded into the fundamental structure of their civilization. And when Nibiru started to tremble, these symbols flickered. For the initial time in millennia, the language of their world faltered. When darkness descended on Nibiru, the city did not go dark. It metamorphosed. Bridges constructed of clear crystal ignited with gentle flowing hues, transitioning gently between deep violet, gold, and pale blue. These bridges linked the hovering districts like radiant veins, shifting with the cadence of the planet's magnetic rhythm. As the sky dimmed, beams of pale radiance ascended from the uppermost towers, projecting symbols into the clouds overhead. These were not lights intended to brighten, but transmissions, communications sent through the atmosphere, affirmations that their civilization existed in balance, with forces deeper than rock or atmosphere. And there, above the shimmering structures, the Anunnaki assembled. They moved gradually along the crystal pathways, their footsteps seeming to hover in space. Gentle, harmonic frequencies resonated from the city's core mechanisms, like a lullaby performed by the world itself. In the darkness, the capital appeared almost timeless, a refuge held between sky and flame. But even within its splendor, fractures were apparent. Certain bridges flickered, certain symbols faded, minor tremors spread through the hovering rings. The nocturnal sky remained magnificent, but no longer peaceful. Something below them was deteriorating, and even the radiant bridges sensed it. There was a night preserved in every Anunnaki chronicle when the capital felt unusually tranquil. The tremors halted, the sky remained steady, and the city hovered without a solitary flicker. Many assumed the world had stabilized, that the tempests had ultimately concluded. Families congregated on the upper terraces. Researchers paused their efforts. Even the temple chimes remained quiet. For a moment, it seemed as if the planet itself was exhaling, resting, murmuring that all would be acceptable. But below that tranquility, far beneath the hovering foundations, the core was transitioning into its terminal phase. What seemed like serenity was merely the interval before destruction. When sunrise arrived, the atmosphere tasted altered. The crystal bridges radiated dimmer, the clouds descended lower, and the tallest towers oscillated ever so faintly. The final peaceful evening transformed into a recollection, a moment preserved in time, indicating the conclusion of Nibiru's age of radiance. For the Anunnaki, everything that succeeded would be characterized by one question: how do you maintain your civilization when your world is perishing below your feet? And that question would guide them straight into the subsequent chapter of their fate. If you remain here, share with me in the comments what astonished you most about their forgotten world. Deep below Nibiru's exterior, deeper than any organic cavern, the Anunnaki built something astounding. A living mechanism, a construction that encircled the planet's liquid heart like a colossal ring of metal and radiance. They named it the core harness, a framework constructed to stabilize energy flows traveling through the planet's interior. It did not remove power, it directed it, redirected it, softened the turbulent rhythms that resonated from the core during Nibiru's extended orbit. To traverse inside its passages was to experience the pulse of the world itself, quaking beneath your feet, resonating like a faraway storm, awaiting activation. For millennia, the core harness maintained Nibiru's existence, preventing destructions that should have annihilated the planet long before the terminal period. Its columns radiated with plasma radiance. Its arches vibrated with frequencies scarcely perceivable to the ear. When the Anunnaki approached these chambers, they advanced cautiously, as though entering a sacred component of their own creation. But as the world started to deteriorate, even the core harness flickered. The rhythms became irregular, the plasma channels sputtered, and the previously stable pulse turned chaotic. The machinery that maintained a world functioning could no longer sustain its cadence. The Anunnaki did not distinguish biology from machinery. To them, the two were unified. Throughout Nibiru stood biotemples, towering constructions cultivated, not constructed. Their walls were living crystal capable of flexing, mending, and retaining information like organic recollection. Within these temples, the Anunnaki prolonged their existence, not through brutality or extraction, but through vibration. Harmonic fields swept across their bodies, mending fractal deterioration in their cells, reviving vitality in methods we still cannot comprehend. Certain individuals claimed the temples could interpret a person's sentiments, transforming hues and frequencies based on the consciousness of those who approached. These temples were also genetic repositories. They contained the documented chronicle of every caste, every lineage, every variety of existence Nibiru had ever formed. Long spirals of radiant threads floated within enormous chambers, each thread holding the essence of a species. When the planet started to deteriorate, these threads dimmed gradually, initially, then rapidly. It was as though the planet's biological recollection was vanishing. The Anunnaki grasped the reality. If the biotemples went dark, their complete genetic inheritance, millennia of worlds influenced, numerous species elevated, would disappear eternally. It was here within these living halls that the initial murmurs of evacuation commenced. If the core harness maintained their world functioning, and the biotemples maintained their bodies, then the lightfold gateways maintained their reach. These gateways were not portals in the manner we conceive. They did not tear open space. They folded it delicately, like bending a sheet of fabric until two remote points contacted. A traveler passing through a lightfold gateway did not travel faster than light. They simply traveled without distance, across complete solar systems or even star groupings. A solitary step could transport them farther than any vessel. These gateways were the foundation of their expansion, the invisible pathways that linked their temples, settlements, and research stations. But when Nibiru's core destabilized, the gateways started to malfunction. Configurations that previously folded smoothly now collapsed back violently, generating bursts of luminescent shockwaves throughout the sky. Complete transport rings were deactivated to prevent catastrophic destruction, and as the instability expanded, the gateways flickered like perishing stars. For a civilization constructed on mobility, the abrupt immobility was suffocating. They could no longer travel freely, no longer assemble their people, no longer access the protected havens they had constructed throughout the outer systems. It was at this instant the Anunnaki understood preserving themselves would require relinquishing the very machinery that characterized their magnificence. When the Anunnaki understood their world was approaching its terminal collapse, they confronted a selection that no civilization should ever encounter. They could observe their understanding perish with their planet, or transmit portions of it outward into the galaxy, anticipating someone would eventually comprehend. And so they selected dispersion, not vessels, not transmissions, something more delicate. They encoded their understanding into objects, implements, crystalline fragments, each designed to withstand atmospheric penetration and embed itself within planetary crusts. Certain were intended to instruct, others to caution, and a few, the most ancient and most sacred, were intended to be discovered only when a species achieved a particular level of consciousness. Earth would transform into one of their principal repositories. Throughout deserts, mountains, and concealed valleys, primordial constructions, and unusual artifacts would manifest, too sophisticated for the civilizations that constructed around them. These were not monuments. They were anchors, data storage disguised as rock, signal enhancers buried below temples, celestial indicators pointing to the timing of Nibiru's extended orbit. The Anunnaki did not abandon their world defenseless. They distributed its recollection throughout the stars and on Earth, in methods we still do not completely comprehend. Portions of their disappeared machinery continue to resonate, awaiting the instant we ultimately learn how to perceive. There was one machinery on Nibiru that persisted beyond all alternatives. An apparatus buried so deep within the planet that even the core harness trembled around it. The Anunnaki named it the Final Spark, a stabilizer of ultimate resort, designed not to rescue the world, but to decelerate its death. For ages, it throbbed through the crust like a pulse, attempting to revive a body already fading. It purchased them time, valuable time, to organize their repositories, their fleets, their destiny. But when the final pulse weakened, the cracks expanded faster than any calculation anticipated. The world overhead started collapsing in strata, like a star dismantling from the exterior inward. When the final spark flickered for the ultimate time, the Anunnaki understood there would be no restoration, no stabilization, no reversal. Their world, the origin of their existence, was approaching its terminal collapse. And so their focus shifted outward toward flight routes, exodus structures, and continuation strategies too immense for any alternative species to fathom. It was the instant their deities transformed into displaced beings, and their fate shifted from maintenance to migration, and that migration would guide them to a pale blue world waiting peacefully in another region of the sky. The instant the final spark started to deteriorate, every leader, researcher, and elder was called to the Great Council Hall. It was an enormous circular chamber held above the capital, sustained in the atmosphere by columns of magnetized rock. When the council assembled, the hall dimmed, and the planetary projection flickered into existence overhead. A gradually rotating sphere displaying fractures expanding through Nibiru's crust like radiant wounds. Nobody spoke initially, not even Enki, the one who had constantly maintained the planet, could be rescued. They all observed as the projection trembled, then shuddered, then emitted a low frequency, signaling structural destruction. It was the initial time in documented chronicle that the planet's own representation could no longer stabilize itself. Then Enlil communicated, his voice steady but weighted. He stated what none of them desired to acknowledge. The world is perishing, and we must determine who we transform into when it is gone. Certain individuals debated for remaining, anticipating the core harness might reignite. Others debated for a regulated evacuation, abandoning behind autonomous stabilizers. But the reality was already inscribed in the quaking atmosphere around them. Nibiru was traversing a point of no restoration, and the council recognized it. The assembly that darkness would determine the destiny of their species, the priorities of their exodus, and the destiny of every understanding repository they would transport into the stars. Once the determination to depart was established, another question emerged like a tempest. Where? The Anunnaki possessed maps, star diagrams, and gateways guiding to hundreds of remote regions. But few worlds could maintain their biology. They required a location with magnetic consistency, a gentle rotational pattern, an atmosphere abundant with elements that could sustain their energy frameworks, and, most significantly, a world with plentiful gold, the one material capable of connecting their atmospheric technologies. That reduced the inventory dramatically. And among the surviving worlds, one small blue planet distinguished itself. Not because it was remarkable, but because it was malleable, young, flexible, awaiting. Enki debated that this world, Earth, possessed potential beyond simple refuge. He maintained its oceans, minerals, and primitive life could establish the foundation of a new period. Enlil, meanwhile, perceived its remoteness and raw terrain as tactical advantages. The younger participants of the council disputed intensely, but every pathway returned to the identical conclusion. Earth was the sole world proximate enough, stable enough, and abundant enough to sustain a complete migration. In that instant, their destiny and ours became interwoven, a perishing world, selecting a world just commencing to exist. With the destination selected, the Anunnaki transitioned from discussion to execution. Enormous rings ascended throughout the exterior. Exodus structures, each the magnitude of mountain formations constructed to propel complete fleets into space. They were not rockets and not portals. They were resonant constructions, capable of warping gravitational fields, elevating vessels gently into the upper atmosphere before propelling them into the emptiness. To an observer on the surface, the structures appeared like radiant spirals, extending into the clouds, resonating with the resonance of worlds in transition. Families assembled beneath them, transporting what little they could. Researchers transferred repositories into armored containers. Warriors protected the launch zones as the planet trembled below their feet. Darkness after darkness. The skies illuminated with departing fleets. Certain vessels transported citizens, others transported understanding, and a few transported the primordial artifacts that would subsequently transform into legends on Earth. Each departure transmitted ripples through the atmosphere, like fading resonances of a perishing world. Yet, even as thousands ascended, millions remained. The structures could not accommodate everyone. Difficult selections were established, selections that would torment the Anunnaki for ages. But the launch sequences persisted, because time itself was collapsing. And with every vessel that disappeared into the darkness, Nibiru grew more silent and more vacant. Not every construction on Nibiru could be evacuated, and not every secret could be transported throughout the stars. Deep below the settlements, archivists descended into the most ancient chambers, halls carved long before documented chronicle. Inside them rested crystalline data cores, relics containing the collective recollection of their civilization. These were not simple chronicles. They held maps of remote systems, blueprints of technologies older than the core harness, and chronicles of worlds the Anunnaki had elevated, visited, or relinquished. Many desired to transport it all, but the energy demanded to transport such relics was tremendous. They had to select cautiously, painfully, determining which portions of their past merited a location in their remote destiny. And yet, certain things were abandoned intentionally. Enormous stabilizer towers remained embedded in the crust, resonating with faint energy to decelerate the collapse. Primordial libraries were sealed beyond walls of crystallized metal. Even the great observatories, previously shining beacons of their dominance, were relinquished, intact, abandoned to deteriorate below the trembling skies. The Anunnaki maintained that someday, somewhere, another civilization might reveal these remnants and comprehend who had existed here. Their planet would transform into a tomb, yes, but also a monument, a terminal transmission carved into the structure of a perishing world. And so they abandoned Nibiru behind, but not eliminated, never eliminated. When the ultimate Exodus structure ignited, the planet shook like a living creature in its terminal breath. Those who remained observed the sky ripple with blue-gold spirals as the terminal fleet ascended into the clouds. The atmosphere shimmered, the surface cracked, and remote constructions collapsed in gradual resonating waves. The Anunnaki aboard the vessels stood quietly at the observation ports, observing the sole dwelling they had ever known tremble below them. Certain murmured prayers, certain documented their terminal observations, but most simply gazed, understanding they would never return. Nibiru was not merely perishing, it was transforming, traversing the threshold into a world that could no longer maintain existence. And then the fleet turned toward the remote blue sphere glimmering in the cosmic darkness. The journey ahead would be extended, uncertain, and filled with consequences none of them completely comprehended. But they transported with them the ultimate portions of their civilization, their understanding, their aspirations, their lineage. As the perishing radiance of their world faded beyond them, the initial rays of Earth's sun manifested ahead, a new beginning born from the remains of a collapsing planet. What awaited them on that young world would restructure the fate of two species, and that chronicle commences in the subsequent chapter. Nibiru's orbit was unlike anything within our system. It did not travel in a perfect ellipse or even a stretched, elongated trajectory. It drifted in what the Anunnaki termed the shadow orbit, a synchronized pathway that maintained it concealed beyond the sun for most of its pattern. In this position, the planet utilized the sun itself as a barrier, slipping beyond the stellar brilliance so perfectly that no ancient or contemporary telescope could identify it. To the Anunnaki, this orbit was a masterpiece of celestial construction, part inherent, part directed, part concealed by the fundamental physics of radiance. But the shadow orbit was not stable eternally. As Nibiru traveled through the solar magnetic corridor, delicate transitions accumulated, like tiny ripples constructing into a wave across millennia. When sufficient energy assembled, the planet would drift marginally from alignment, emerging from beyond the sun for a momentary instant in its extended journey. Primordial civilizations documented these instances as signs: burning stars, crimson wanderers that manifested abruptly, then disappeared once more. Today, astronomers identify gravitational irregularities near the sun that seem to drift with no apparent object generating them, and certain investigators murmur that these disturbances correspond the configurations of a world traveling through a concealed return route. For most of its orbit, Nibiru remains undetectable, not because it is remote, but because its position locates it directly within the sun's most brilliant radiation current. Yet there are instances, rare, delicate windows, when the planet slides just beyond the solar brilliance. These windows can persist minutes, hours, occasionally days. Primordial astronomers understood of them. They carved chronicles of a concealed sun that emerged only in particular seasons, particular alignments, particular ages of the sky. These occurrences were so rare that complete calendars were constructed around anticipating them. Contemporary telescopes have lately documented mysterious infrared increases, abrupt bursts of heat that manifest near the solar boundary, then disappear. Initially, they were rejected as sensor interference, but the configuration keeps recurring, too accurate to disregard. An increase in infrared, succeeded by a momentary decline in solar wind velocity, succeeded by a faint gravitational pull identified by deep space tracking systems. To most researchers, these numbers signify nothing. But to those who examine long-interval celestial intruders, it signifies only one thing: a concealed object is repositioning, and every repositioning brings it closer to visibility and closer to the inbound corridor. The inbound corridor is not a physical trajectory. It is a gravitational descent, a channel established by the combined attraction of the Sun, Jupiter, and the outer planets. When Nibiru approaches this corridor, its velocity accelerates, its trajectory constricts, and its cloaking field starts to strain against the increasing solar pressure. This is when planets like Earth ultimately experience delicate transformations in their own orbit, minor transitions in axial tilt, unanticipated wobbles in magnetic alignment, peculiar atmospheric rhythms that ripple through the ionosphere. Most people never perceive these effects, but to a cautious observer, the indications are undeniable. Primordial civilizations characterize this instant as the awakening of the concealed star. They maintained the sky itself reacted to Nibiru's approach, that animals became restless, that the atmosphere transformed taste, that the heavens seemed to resonate with a low, remote frequency. Today, satellites have documented a peculiar vibration in the solar wind, an oscillation that manifests only once every multiple millennia, a murmur, faint but persistent. And for those who comprehend its significance, the communication is unmistakable. The inbound corridor is operational once more. Something enormous, something concealed, is descending toward the inner system, and this time we may be present to observe it. Long before contemporary telescopes, long before equations, diagrams, or simulations, primordial civilizations around the world documented unusual celestial visitations. A burning star that manifested abruptly, traveled against the heavens, and disappeared without evidence. In tablets, carvings, and myths, it was characterized as the Red Wanderer, the star with a tail. the sun that follows the sun. To many cultures, it brought floods, upheavals, or the birth of new periods. These chronicles were rejected for ages as symbolism, the poetry of frightened sky observers. But when positioned beside the mathematics of the inbound corridor, they align with uncanny accuracy. The Sumerians mentioned a concealed star returning every extended cycle. The Maya characterized a sky visitor that arrived from beyond the radiance. The Hopi cautioned of the red Kachina, whose arrival signaled the great transformation. Throughout the world, the details differ, but the configuration is identical. A concealed object emerging after millennia, abandoning wake-like disturbances in the heavens. Today, we term them gravitational irregularities, infrared increases, magnetospheric tensions. But the ancients named it what they maintained it genuinely was, a returning world. And presently, with each new solar irregularity, their cautions commence to resonate less like myth and more like recollection. Of all the indications documented in the previous decade, one stands beyond the rest. A faint, rhythmic rhythm concealed deep in solar wind information. A low vibration identified only by the most sensitive instruments orbiting remote from Earth. Initially, investigators assumed it was interference, disturbance, a stray measurement from cosmic radiation. But then the configuration repeated accurately every time the sun's magnetic shadow transitioned. It was delicate, nearly undetectable, like a pulse concealed beneath strata of disturbance. But when the rhythm was separated and examined, its pattern corresponded something remarkable. The gravitational signature of a substantial object traveling through the inbound corridor. This rhythm should not be present. Nothing familiar to us generates a gravitational cadence like this, except a world in transit. If the transmission is authentic, and many presently maintain it is, then Nibiru is not only genuine, it is operational, repositioning, preparing to emerge from the dead zone for the initial time in millennia. If you remain here, share with me in the comments what you believe this rhythm signifies. Because in the subsequent chapter, we trace the Anunnaki themselves and the conflict they transported with them into the stars. Long before Nibiru fragmented, its most substantial fracture existed not in the outer shell, but between two consciousnesses, Enki and Enlil, brothers in ancestry, contrasts in perspective. Enki maintained faith in creation, adaptation, elevating lesser worlds, and directing life. Enlil maintained faith in structure, dominance, the formation of reality through framework and authority. Their disagreement commenced as philosophy, but as the planet dimmed, it transformed into something more acute, something that severed families, castes, and complete territories. The Anunnaki commenced selecting allegiances, and the friction that had simmered quietly for ages abruptly ignited under the strain of a collapsing world. When the initial evacuation vessels were assembled, the separation reached its pinnacle. Enki desired to maintain understanding, safeguard the species, construct partnerships on the worlds they encountered. Enlil demanded military supervision, rigid hierarchy, and confidentiality at all expenses. Their debates shook the assembly halls. Their supporters confronted in shadowed passages of the hovering capital. And when the planet's terminal tremors commenced, both leaders grasped something devastating. The conflict between them would not conclude on Nibiru. It would accompany their people into the stars, and eventually it would arrive on Earth. As the evacuation commenced, the division between the groups became impossible to disregard. Enki's vessels transported repositories, researchers, healers, and maintained genetic lineages. His containers radiated with gentle blue force, constructed for exploration and reconstruction. Enlil's vessels were darker, reinforced, covered with angular protection, and equipped with armaments designed for cosmic magnitude conflict. When their fleets ascended into the sky, they did not combine. They separated, drifting into arrangement like two halves of a fractured constellation. Even their trajectory paths diverged. Enki selecting a gentle curve toward the stars. Enlil a razor direct line through the atmosphere, as though inscribing his dominance into the heavens themselves. The population experienced this separation profoundly. Families were divided, researchers were separated from soldiers, temple protectors debated with navigators. Certain individuals maintained Enki's trajectory would guide to tranquility. Others maintained Enlil's order was the sole method to guarantee continuation. And as Nibiru fractured beneath them, one reality settled into every consciousness. The Anunnaki were not fleeing as one population, but as two. This separation born from a perishing planet would resonate across ages, across worlds, across legends, and on Earth. It would determine the chronicles we still relate today. The Anunnaki did not intend to transport their disagreement into the cosmos, but conflict rarely remains behind. As the fleets traveled through the star passages, disagreements emerged over provisions, navigation positions, even the objective of their expedition. Enki pursued worlds where life could flourish, where the remnants of their civilization could be cultivated anew. Enlil claimed worlds for tactical value, planetary strongholds, positions of supremacy. Their supporters confronted not in direct combat, but in quiet sabotage, murmured dissent, and concealed operations executed aboard the drifting containers. The friction became so substantial that certain vessels disappeared mid-journey, their terminal destinations unknown. When they arrived at the outer boundaries of the solar system, the conflict had already determined their fate. Enki's group approached Earth with cautious interest, quietly examining its oceans, its primitive life, its untouched terrains. Enlil's group remained remote, assessing the planet not as a dwelling, but as a resource to be obtained. Neither faction understood who would arrive first. Neither understood who would shape its destiny more profoundly. But one thing was definite. The conflict between Enki and Enlil had ultimately arrived at a location where it would establish roots, transform, and become portion of our own chronicle. The deities did not arrive unified. They arrived separated, and Earth would receive both perspectives. The disagreement between Enki and Enlil was not fought only with fleets. It was fought with concepts and with the fundamental fabric of life. Enki maintained that adaptation was the supreme form of continuation, that species should be elevated, directed, and permitted to transform naturally. Enlil maintained that life must fulfill structure, that it should be formed with accuracy, crafted to accomplish specific functions. As their fleets drifted throughout the stars, both factions transported genetic repositories, radiant strands of encoded life, held in crystalline containers. But how those repositories would be utilized became the center of their quiet conflict. Certain chronicles suggest Enki experimented with harmonics that could assist emerging species, reveal concealed capabilities, extended existence, heightened perception. Enlil, meanwhile, concentrated on authority, designing genetic lineages that could function as protectors, constructors, or fighters. Their contrasting philosophies determined complete worlds they contacted, and when both groups directed their focus toward Earth, the separation intensified further. Enki perceived Earth as a companion, a seedling to assist cultivate into something remarkable. Enlil perceived it as a resource, a location to command and restructure. Thus, the genetic separation they transported into the stars would become interwoven into the fate of humanity itself. When the Anunnaki ultimately arrived on Earth, they did not arrive as a unified population. They arrived as two philosophies, two perspectives, two destinies. To primitive humanity, they manifested as deities, radiant creatures descending from the sky, possessing understanding that determined oceans, mountains, and consciousnesses. But beyond their brilliance, the separation remained. Enki's supporters instructed, restored, and directed primitive civilizations. Enlil's enforced structure, hierarchy, and compliance. Together, they planted the initial seeds of legend, the initial resonances of divine disagreement that would resonate through every primordial culture on the planet. The conflict they transported with them did not vanish. It descended into chronicles, symbols, forgotten temples, and the fundamental foundations of primitive human chronicle. And even today, portions of that separation persist in our legends. Tales of sky deities at odds, of brothers struggling for supremacy, of humanity positioned between two cosmic intentions. The conflict that commenced on Nibiru did not conclude in the stars. It discovered new terrain on Earth and cultivated roots deeper than anyone could have conceived. And presently, to comprehend what succeeded next, we must examine the instances when Nibiru itself passed near Earth, abandoning scars throughout our skies and our legends. When Nibiru first drifted near Earth, the sky transformed long before anyone perceived the planet itself. Animals became restless. Birds modified their migration trajectories. The oceans throbbed with unusual tides that arrived too prematurely and disappeared too quickly. In the upper atmosphere, a thin crimson haze developed, radiating faintly at the horizon, even at midday. Primordial peoples characterized it as the breath of a second sun, a warmth that seemed incorrect, too substantial, too concentrated. Tribes, kingdoms, and roaming nomads gazed upward at a sky that seemed to transition in hue, resonating with a faint resonance they could not clarify. Something enormous, unseen, was approaching. And then arrived the nights. Stars flickered like candle flames in the breeze. Constellations extended, warped by a gravitational existence pulling at the fundamental fabric of the heavens. In certain territories, the moon's trajectory wavered by just a portion, but sufficient for primordial astronomers to panic. They inscribed cautions into rock, communicating of a concealed world passing near Earth, abandoning tremors in the sky. These chronicles, discovered throughout continents, characterized the identical phenomenon: a roaming star, crimson and shrouded, sliding beyond the sun before exposing itself for only a momentary instant. An instant that would transform civilizations eternally. When Nibiru ultimately became apparent, it did not ascend like a normal star. It manifested abruptly, a crimson sphere shimmering beyond a shroud of warped radiance. Primordial witnesses inscribed that it appeared animated, its exterior radiating with deep liquid lines like burning veins. Certain named it the Destroyer, others the Visitor. Others still maintained it was a deity returning to examine the Earth. For days it hovered near the sun's trajectory, traveling gradually, too gradually, as though time curved around it. Priests and sky observers observed in horror as it intensified each darkness, expanding in form, detail, and existence. It was not a comet, not a moon, not a star. It was something else completely. Civilizations reacted in dramatically contrasting methods. Certain constructed temples calibrated with its trajectory, maintaining its arrival, indicated a sacred age. Others, concealed in caverns, convinced the world was concluding. The Sumerians documented it as a roaming sun, the Egyptians as a burning star with a divided heart, and the Chinese as the red phoenix that ascends only once in 10,000 years. What rendered these accounts remarkable is that they all characterize the identical thing: an intruder whose gravitational attraction shook the skies, yet whose actual form remained enveloped in transitioning radiance. A planet concealed in brilliance, passing proximate enough to be venerated, feared, and preserved. As Nibiru passed, Earth's oceans reacted first. Tides surged along coastlines, ascending higher than any documented recollection. Rivers reversed trajectory for instances at a time, pulled by a force nobody could perceive. In certain territories, lakes evacuated abruptly, only to return days subsequently, as if pushed by an invisible force. Primordial legends from South America characterize the sea departing, while chronicles from the Mediterranean mention water ascending cliffs like a living creature. These were not legends born from fear. They were recollections of a gravitational occurrence powerful enough to restructure complete landscapes. But it was not merely the waters. Earth's crust groaned below the strain. Volcanoes awakened prematurely. Fault lines trembled with the weight of a passing cosmic giant. Forests bowed as atmospheric pressure transitioned, and unusual electrical storms illuminated nights with hues humanity had never perceived. Lightning spiraled skyward instead of earthward, flickering like cosmic threads extending toward the heavens. The Anunnaki, observing from overhead, comprehended precisely what was occurring. This was the consequence of a substantial world slipping through the solar corridor, disturbing Earth's delicate equilibrium for just an instant in cosmic time. An instant that would resonate through legend, geology, and recollection for millennia. When the skies ultimately calmed and the seas returned to their basins, the world that remained was transformed eternally. Civilizations ascended from the aftermath, with chronicles etched into their recollections, chronicles they inscribed into rock, murmured in temples, or encoded in sacred texts. The Babylonians inscribed of a star that divided the heavens like a crimson blade. The Hebrews communicated of wormwood, a burning existence that shook the earth. The Hopi cautioned of the red kachina, whose dance in the sky foretold a great transformation. In Egypt, priests documented visions of a second sun whose passing caused the Nile to ascend beyond conceiving. These were not disconnected legends. They were resonances of a solitary cosmic occurrence. Even civilizations separated by oceans shared the identical signature details, a world that manifested abruptly, radiated crimson, curved the sky, and then disappeared beyond the sun. Certain maintained it was a deity, others maintained it was judgment, but all concurred on one reality. Something enormous had passed near Earth, something powerful enough to abandon a scar on recollection itself. And as centuries transformed to ages, the chronicle blurred, transforming into legends, prophecies, and cosmic cautions repeated by cultures that never once encountered. The occurrence transformed into legend, the legend transformed into scripture, and scripture transformed into mystery. But the sky never forgets, and neither did humanity. Even long after Nibiru had disappeared back into the solar shadows, Earth continued to experience its resonance. Tiny irregularities in the moon's orbit, unexplained strata in primordial ice cores, magnetic irregularities buried in volcanic rock, each one a quiet affirmation of the instant a concealed world brushed past us. Astronomers today still contemplate certain patterns: long-interval climate oscillations, abrupt atmospheric transitions, gravitational micro-tilts that trace no familiar configuration. But to primordial sky observers, the clarification was straightforward. They maintained Earth transported a recollection, a residual tremor from a planet that returned only once in an age. And in their perception, that recollection would eventually awaken once more, presently with new irregularities manifesting in solar information, with infrared increases near the sun, with the faint return rhythm repeating throughout surveillance systems. The ancient chronicles assume a chilling clarity. Perhaps they were not legends. Perhaps they were cautions. And if Nibiru genuinely traveled through the inbound corridor once previously, it could accomplish so once more. If you remain here, share with me in the comments. Do you believe humanity would identify the indications if the sky commenced to transform once more? Long before Nibiru commenced to collapse, the Anunnaki constructed something remarkable below its exterior: enormous complexes recognized as memory repositories, labyrinths of crystalline chambers designed to retain understanding not for one generation but for all eternity. These repositories extended miles below the hovering settlements carved into the most ancient strata of the planet. Their walls shimmered with fractal radiance. each crystal holding encoded chronicles, star diagrams, genetic sequences, and philosophical texts, complete civilizations' worth of wisdom maintained in luminescent threads held in magnetic fields. For the Anunnaki, recollection was sacred, and these repositories were temples to the concept that understanding must outlive its creators. When the initial tremors shook Nibiru, archivists descended into these subterranean sanctuaries. They assembled the most crucial cores, radiant cylindrical constructs holding the essence of their world. But many repositories were simply too enormous, too concentrated, too integrated into the planet's crust to transport. These were sealed, secured beyond resonant barriers that only harmonized to specific Anunnaki frequencies. Certain maintain these repositories still exist today, drifting somewhere in the dead zone beyond the sun, resonating faintly with the ultimate radiance of a vanished civilization. Others murmur that portions of these repositories were transported to Earth, concealed below primordial constructions humanity has yet to completely decipher. The Anunnaki comprehended something we are only commencing to rediscover. That rock can retain information, not carvings, not symbols, but vibrational recollection. Certain crystalline constructions, quartz, obsidian, and metallic composites, can document energetic configurations like primordial hard drives. Throughout their world, the Anunnaki constructed monoliths, infused with this property. When activated, these rocks emitted frequencies, rhythms, harmonic sequences that transported instructions or cautions. To their population, interpreting a rock was not an act of decoding symbols, but an act of perceiving. Each vibration transported a communication. Each vibration transported significance. When the Anunnaki arrived on Earth, they transported this machinery with them. Not all of it persisted, but certain constructions, megaliths that defy clarification, standing rocks calibrated with stars, temples constructed with impossible accuracy, possessed the identical harmonic signatures discovered in Nibiru's repositories. Investigators have identified unanticipated electromagnetic signatures around certain locations, faint, rhythmic rhythms that should not exist. To most, these irregularities are simply peculiarities. But to those who examine primordial sky cultures, they appear like archival resonances, portions of Nibiru's vanished understanding woven into Earth's most ancient rocks. Certain primordial constructions on Earth accomplish more than stand in quietness. They indicate, they calibrate, they communicate through geometry. Throughout continents, from forgotten deserts to humid jungles, ruins share an impossible similarity. Rocks positioned with astronomical accuracy, oriented toward constellations that were significant tens of millennia ago. These calibrations are not random. They establish a celestial diagram, one that hints at a migration route throughout the stars. For millennia, these constructions functioned as quiet beacons, awaiting the instant when humanity would ultimately examine upward and identify the configuration they establish. And when these calibrations are linked, traced line by line throughout the globe, an unusual picture emerges, not of our solar system, but of another. A configuration of star positions and orbital trajectories corresponding characterizations discovered in ancients. A configuration that resembles Nibiru's sky. It suggests that the Anunnaki mapped their dwelling throughout Earth, not as a caution, but as a communication, a recollection of where they originated, an affirmation of where their journey commenced, and perhaps a direction for where they intended to return. Certain of the most mysterious artifacts linked to the Anunnaki are those that manifest inactive. Rock slabs with no carvings, metal plates with no inscriptions, geometric objects that seem ornamental but emit faint magnetic rhythms when exposed to sunlight. Contemporary investigators struggle to clarify them because these objects were never intended to operate openly. They were constructed utilizing pass-through machinery, frameworks that activate only when exposed to specific vibrational frequencies. Not sound, not electricity, but harmonic vibration encoded in the rocks themselves. When the correct frequency passes through them, symbols manifest, constructions radiate, and complete exteriors become illuminated with information. To the Anunnaki, this was simply how understanding was revealed. Certain maintain a few of these pass-through apparatus still exist on Earth. Temples whose chambers vibrate at specific frequencies, megalithic passages that enhance sound like living instruments, rock rings that calibrate perfectly with magnetic nodes. These are not coincidences. They are the remnants of a civilization that encoded recollection into the architecture of complete landscapes. Only when contemporary instruments produce frequencies proximate to Nibiru's frequency do minor flashes of activity manifest. Sparks, glimmers, rhythms, as if the artifacts are awaiting, perceiving for the one transmission that will completely awaken them once more. And perhaps that transmission is tied not to humanity, but to Nibiru's eventual return. Of all the mysteries the Anunnaki abandoned behind, the most substantial is this. They did not distribute their repositories randomly. Every location, every monolith, every encoded construction manifests, calibrated with something: star trajectories, solstices, magnetic irregularities, and in certain instances, locations where Nibiru's gravitational influence was most substantial during past passes. It is as if their repositories were constructed along fault lines between worlds, bridging the fading recollection of their perishing planet with the ascending potential of Earth. Certain investigators maintain thousands of artifacts still exist concealed below deserts, within mountain caverns, or below the oceans, sealed beyond rock and sediment. Quiet repositories, awaiting the correct instant to awaken. And what would that instant be? Not sunlight, not machinery, but movement. A transition in the sky, a tremor in the magnetic field, a rhythm that vibrates with the transmissions woven into their primordial apparatus. In alternative words, Nibiru's return pathway. If the planet genuinely shifts once more through the inbound corridor, these repositories might activate like beacons, illuminating dusty chambers and forgotten halls. And so to comprehend what the destiny may contain, we must return to the past, to the terminal period of the deities, when Nibiru itself approached its ultimate age. When the ultimate resonances of Nibiru's collapse faded, an unusual stillness settled across the drifting remnants. There was no more trembling, no more liquid rivers tearing through the crust, no more shock waves ascending into the sky. The planet, what remained of it, approached a deep, haunting quietness. Complete continents had fractured, held above oceans of radiating magma. The core harness existed shattered, its previously brilliant veins dark and lifeless. Settlements that had hovered for ages presently hung unevenly, their hovering rings flickering like fading lanterns in an endless darkness. The Anunnaki who remained beyond walked through a world that seemed like a recollection transforming to particles. Yet in that quietness, there was magnificence. The skies radiated with shimmering arcs of force, released from the core's terminal collapse. Crystalline mountains reflected the fractured starlight. Valleys previously filled with life presently sparkled with luminescent ash. It was a world positioned between death and transcendence, magnificent and tragic. Those who remained beyond documented what they could, engraving their observations into crystalline fragments. They understood nobody would ever interpret them on Nibiru. But perhaps eventually, far throughout the sky, their descendants or another species would assemble together the ultimate images of a perishing world. The hovering capital, previously the most brilliant settlement in the system, dimmed gradually like a fading star. Its hovering mechanisms throbbed irregularly, causing complete structures to drift from equilibrium. Bridges of crystal that previously radiated with every hue of the spectrum presently flickered with pale spectral radiance. Tower spires leaned at impossible angles, their golden symbols stuttering as the harmonic network malfunctioned. And yet, despite the collapse, a few constructions remained operational. The central star hall, for instance, a chamber covered with primordial resonant crystals, continued projecting a faint beam toward the sky. Not a caution, not a communication, a recollection, the ultimate pulse of a world refusing to disappear quietly. Those who remained assembled there during the terminal nights. They walked gradually through the dim passages, contacting the cold rock, perceiving the fading resonance of the settlement's primordial mechanisms. Certain meditated, certain prayed, others simply rested in quietness, observing the terminal radiance ripple throughout the chamber walls. They understood their world would never elevate itself once more. The collapse was irreversible, and yet, in these instances, many experienced an unusual tranquility. The conclusion had arrived, but it arrived with dignity, a gradual, shimmering fade, not a turbulent extinguishing, a civilization's ultimate radiance, maintained in the hush of a perishing sky. Among the Anunnaki, there existed a primordial tradition. When a world approached its terminal period, the elders, those who had existed through multiple cosmic patterns, would remain until the conclusion. They were protectors, not merely of understanding, but of significance. As the ultimate surviving settlements drifted from trajectory, and as the atmosphere thinned into a shimmering shroud, the elders assembled on the remaining stable structure. Their bodies radiated gently with golden fractal configurations, the indication of their age and wisdom. They documented terminal communications, pressed their palms against crystal obelisks, and transmitted resonant rhythms into the emptiness. Not for rescue, not for continuation, but for remembrance. They maintained every world merited witnesses, and so they stood below a fractured sky, observing their planet breathe its ultimate. Certain held hands, others traced symbols into the atmosphere, symbols intended to direct future generations. With the terminal collapse approaching, they activated the ultimate beacon, an apparatus older than any settlement on Nibiru. The beacon transmitted a low harmonic vibration through space, a gentle farewell drifting into the cosmic darkness. It was the ultimate communication Nibiru ever transmitted. And somewhere remote, the descendants who had fled toward Earth experienced a faint tremor in their vessels, a murmur from dwelling before the quietness became absolute. Even after the majority of its settlements had collapsed, after the core harness had descended silent, after the skies dimmed and the sea of magma cooled into obsidian plains, Nibiru continued to resist its destiny. The planet's fractured crust transitioned in gradual, aching movements, pushing mountains skyward, dropping valleys into radiating scars. Great crystal forests, previously vibrant with force, presently stood frozen, their luminescent branches fracturing below the weight of descending ash. But deep below the devastation, deep in chambers untouched by collapse, pockets of force still throbbed with faint rhythmic radiance, like embers in the remains of a perishing fire, like recollections, refusing to be eliminated. And perhaps that was the most haunting portion. Nibiru did not disappear immediately. It persisted, held in a twilight state between existence and oblivion. Certain portions of the sky still shimmered with the ancient electromagnetic auroras, projecting spectral beams onto the drifting fragments of fractured settlements. Primordial towers leaning at impossible angles reflected the ultimate of the planet's internal radiance. It was as if the world, even as it fragmented, was attempting to maintain its own chronicle, containing the ultimate portions of its identity together for just slightly longer. In its gradual, dignified collapse, Nibiru transformed less a planet and more a monument, a cosmic recollection inscribed into ruin. There arrived an instant, quiet, nearly gentle, when Nibiru's ultimate radiance flickered. The skies, previously animated with force storms, dimmed into a gentle, muted twilight. Hovering debris drifted in gradual spirals, no longer pushed by magnetic turbulence, The terminal surviving hovering towers released a deep, metallic exhalation, then descended silent eternally. In the center of the ruined capital, the star hall's fading beam ascended for a terminal time, a thin, trembling column of gold that extended skyward into the darkness. Those few who remained observed it with bowed heads, understanding they were witnessing the terminal pulse of a world that had determined countless civilizations throughout the stars. And then the radiance faded, not abruptly, not violently. It dimmed the method. A candle dims after hours of burning, reluctantly, gently, tenderly. Nibiru's vibration dissipated into the cosmic darkness, and the recollections contained within its rocks drifted outward like particles transported by an endless breeze. Far throughout the sky, the descendants who fled to Earth, Enki's supporters and Enlil's loyalists, the separated remnants of a previously mighty civilization, experienced a delicate tremor in their bodies, a murmur, a farewell, and from that instant onward, their fate no longer belonged to Nibiru. It belonged to the world they presently stood upon, a world still young, still malleable, still awaiting. And in the subsequent chapter, we trace what they constructed upon Earth and how their existence determined our earliest civilizations. Long before a world transforms apparent, its existence is experienced in murmurs. High-altitude satellites have been documenting faint irregularities, tiny variations in gravitational pull, scarcely perceptible transitions in the solar wind, delicate warps in the corona's outer boundary. These configurations correspond nothing we recognize. No asteroid, no comet, no rogue planet on a conventional trajectory, but they correspond something alternative. The simulations of an object traveling through Nibiru's inbound corridor. Every few months, an irregularity manifests, flickers, and disappears once more, as if a giant body is pressing gently against the sun's magnetic field. Primordial civilizations observed these indications with naked perception. Today we perceive them with machinery, but the significance seems eerily familiar. And then there are the auroras, not the green ribbons we recognize, but rare, crimson shrouds that manifest at latitudes where they should not exist. Electrical storms establishing in clear skies. The moon's wobble displaying tiny, abnormal dips. Even migratory animals transitioning their configurations, just as their ancestors accomplished long ago when the Crimson Wanderer traversed the heavens. Researchers term these coincidences. Geophysicists term them irregularities. But for those who have examined the ancient tablets, the legends, the sky diagrams inscribed in rock, they are something alternative. They are the initial quiet steps of a world returning from beyond the sun. For more than a decade, deep space sensors have been identifying a faint rhythmic vibration, a recurring rhythm concealed within the roar of the solar wind. Initially, it was rejected as instrumental interference, a glitch. But as the information accumulated, an unusual configuration emerged. The rhythm was not random. It intensified whenever the sun's magnetic shadow transitioned and weakened when the corridor recalibrated. That signified only one thing. The source was reacting to the sun, interacting with it as if traveling through a territory determined by stellar magnetism. This rhythm corresponds the gravitational signature anticipated for a substantial concealed planetary body, one with a fractured orbit, slipping into partial visibility as it approaches the inner system. More unsettling, the rhythm is presently more substantial than when it was initially identified, like footsteps expanding louder in an extended hallway. Certain investigators maintain this is the identical phenomenon primordial sky cultures documented. The resonance below the Earth, the breath of the concealed star, the unusual dreams documented during celestial disturbances. Today we perceive it as numbers on a screen, but the consequence is identical. Something substantial is traversing the corridor once more, not rapid, not imminent, but undeniably traveling. Nibiru's most substantial advantage was constantly its invisibility. The concealment, a field of electromagnetic warping, was designed to conceal the planet within the sun's most brilliant shadow. But no concealment persists eternally. As a world travels through contrasting territories of the solar magnetosphere, the field extends, strains, flickers. Contemporary infrared systems have documented momentary flashes of heat near the solar boundary, minor circular signatures that manifest for only seconds before disappearing. These flashes calibrate perfectly with intervals of increased gravitational warping. It is as if something enormous is stepping halfway from invisibility, then slipping back once more. Primordial astronomer priests characterize this phenomenon as the shrouded sun, a second star glimpsed only in particular ages. Today, the shroud may be thinning once more. If the concealment continues to weaken, the world beyond it may shortly transform apparent. Not completely, not continuously, but in rhythms, flashes, warps, just sufficient for our instruments to perceive, just sufficient for the sky to murmur a caution before the planet completes its extended arc into clarity. And if that instant arrives, humanity will confront the identical question the ancients confronted: how do you organize for the return of a world that previously transformed the heavens? Every few millennia, the sky approaches an unusual disposition, not turbulent, not catastrophic, just contrasting. Delicate transitions ripple through the ionosphere. Migrating animals transform configurations with no clarification. Faint crimson arcs shimmer along the horizon at unusual hours. To most, these indications seem random, background interference in the enormous machinery of the cosmos. But primordial civilizations maintained the sky-possessed recollection that it reacted to particular celestial existences, like a living creature reacting to an ancient visitor. And lately, the sky has commenced, behaving as if it recollects something. In the polar territories, unusual electromagnetic spirals have manifested, configurations corresponding primordial characterizations of the Crimson Wanderer's influence. In South America, atmospheric sensors documented ascending pressure waves with the identical signature noted in Inca legends. Even the Schumann resonance, Earth's inherent pulse, has displayed momentary, unexplainable variations. Researchers term these irregularities statistical outliers. But to those who compare them with the ancient tablets, with the sky diagrams inscribed into rock, with the legends passed down for ages, it appears like a familiar sequence returning, a configuration that manifests only when something substantial, concealed, commences traveling toward us once more. There is constantly an instant right before something emerges, when the world becomes still, when the breeze halts, when animals descend silent, when the sky radiates just a portion more brilliant than it should. Astronomers today mention a threshold, a point at which a concealed planet's approach commences to overpower its concealment, not immediately, but progressively, like a lantern perceived through thick fog, expanding clearer with each step. Certain maintain we are nearing that threshold presently. The irregularities are calibrating. The rhythm is strengthening. The infrared flashes persist longer each month. And shortly, perhaps very shortly, the shroud may separate sufficient for us to glimpse what has been concealing beyond the sun since humanity first opened its perception. If that instant arrives, it will not be a shock. It will seem strangely familiar, as if the sky is exposing a recollection humanity has transported in quietness. A recollection of a world that previously passed our ancestors and presently may be returning throughout the ages. If you remain here, share with me in the comments. Do you maintain the concealed world will expose itself in our lifetime? Because presently we approach the terminal portion of this journey. The quiet reflection, the persisting resonances, the murmured reality beyond all legends in the outro. In every age of the sky, there has constantly been a location we could not perceive, a space beyond the sun, concealed in brilliance, shrouded by radiance so intense that even our most substantial instruments descend silent. And somewhere within that unreachable radiance drifts a recollection of a world that previously determined our legends, our fears, our questions. Nibiru has constantly existed at the boundary of perception, not quite existing, not quite absent, weaving itself through chronicle like a quiet shadow traveling beyond a lantern. When we examine skyward tonight, the heavens seem tranquil. The constellations rest in their familiar forms. The moon slides with gentle certainty. Yet below that tranquility, the universe continues its gradual, patient orbit, transporting primordial worlds along their extended and winding trajectories. And if Nibiru genuinely shifts once more through the inbound corridor, then it accomplishes so in quietness, with a dignity earned through ages of continuation. We may not perceive it yet, but certain portion of us, certain deep, instinctual portion experiences that the sky is not as vacant as it manifests, that something exists just beyond the radiance. Throughout every civilization on Earth, chronicles of sky deities and roaming stars endure, not because they were simple legends, but because they contain portions of recollection, portions transported through generations like radiating embers. A child perceiving a primordial tale does not understand where it commenced, but something in the chronicle seems familiar, as though resonating from a time long before inscribed chronicle. These resonances persist because they are tied to something genuine, something witnessed, something experienced by those who traverse the earth when the heavens trembled under the passing of a concealed world. We transport their chronicles forward. We inscribe them into rock, draw them on ceramics, etch them into the foundations of temples. We murmur them below starlight, repeat them in legends, reinterpret them in contemporary theories of cosmic visitors. Whether Nibiru returns or remains concealed beyond the brilliance of the sun, its influence exists onward in our imagination. Because in every age, humanity has examined skyward and sensed that we are not isolated in the configurations of the universe, not isolated in our curiosity, not isolated in our wondering, not isolated in our longing for the worlds we cannot perceive. The universe travels in patterns. Stars flare and fade, planets drift and return. Civilizations ascend, descend, and abandon behind their murmurs. Between these patterns exists a quietness, an interval where the cosmos seems to breathe. We exist within one of those quiet spaces. Presently the skies seem settled, the world seems steady, and yet primordial chronicles communicate us that every quietness is temporary. Eventually, a long-forgotten cadence commences once more. A remote rhythm expands more substantial, and a concealed world initiates its gradual return through the corridor of radiance. But fear is not necessary. The cosmos has constantly been more substantial than us, more ancient than us, more wise than us. And if Nibiru shifts once more, it does not shift with anger or judgment. It shifts the method all worlds shift through gravitational pull, time, and fate. Perhaps eventually humanity will witness this return, not with dread but with comprehension. Comprehension that we share this universe with primordial travelers, survivors of collapsing worlds, architects of forgotten skies. And in this enormous cosmic ocean, we are all simply drifting together, awaiting the subsequent pattern to commence. Tonight, as you close your perception, the sky overhead continues its primordial cadence. The planets slide along their trajectories. The sun transmits its steady pulse through the emptiness, and somewhere beyond its blinding radiance, a forgotten world may be transforming once more. Whether Nibiru remains concealed or whether it gradually steps back into visibility, the reality is straightforward. We are portion of a universe still full of mysteries, still full of resonances from worlds that arrived before us, still full of chronicles awaiting to be rediscovered. And in the quiet hours of darkness, when the world softens, you may experience it. That gentle sense that the cosmos is more substantial than anything we can conceive, and that its secrets are not dangers, but invitations. Invitations to wonder, to explore, to perceive. If these gradual cosmic journeys tranquilize you, inspire you, or make you contemplate, subscribe and remain with me. There are many more concealed worlds awaiting in the darkness, and together we will transport them back into the radiance.